I'm Dr. Khalilah Harris for the Real News Network. Today we're going to bring you a panel of guests based on the idea that the future depends on knowing. All too often, education reforms are done to community instead of with community. And in order for us to learn more about what community members are interested in seeing for their children and the tools that they need to hold elected officials and appointed officials accountable, it's important that you hear from voices from neighbors like you and that you're able to understand what's at stake. Let's introduce our guest this afternoon. Will you introduce yourself?
My name is Erica Fletcher, and I am a lawyer.
Thank you.
Ebony McKeever, educator for Baltimore City Public Schools.
Angelique Kane, PTO president at Waverly Elementary Middle School and a specialist at University of Maryland, Baltimore.
So welcome, ladies. It looks like we have some Black mama power, which is especially important considering the demographics of Baltimore City. Thank you for joining us. Why don't we jump right into the topic at hand, which is education in Baltimore and in the state of Maryland more broadly. How many of you know what the Commission on Innovation and Excellence in Education is? Okay. So you know it's also called the Kirwan Commission. Yes. Will any one of you tell me about what you know about the commission? What's the purpose of its work? What is it charged to do?
Yes, absolutely. So from my understanding of the Kirwan Commission, they're working to provide a level playing field for all the students in Maryland to make sure that they're achieving and able to compete with students in other states and hopefully nations, countries around the world. I also know that they've set forth 9 recommendations at this point of things that we can do to help improve school systems across Maryland.
Erica, do you know what the progress is for the Kirwan Commission?
I do not know the progress. I do know that the recommendations have not been offered in a policy form to date, and they haven't necessarily trickled down to the students.
Why don't we watch an explainer video about what the Kirwan Commission is, and then we'll talk some more about it. You may have never heard of it, but the Commission on Innovation and Excellence in Education, also known as the Kirwan Commission, is arguably the most influential body in Maryland regarding the future of public education. Named after its chair and Chancellor Emeritus of the University System of Maryland, William Britt Kirwan, the 24-member board is tasked with creating a funding formula and policy recommendations that could impact public education for generations. The board itself is comprised of educators, politicians, and representatives of educational organizations, all selected by a variety of stakeholders, including the governor, the Maryland State School Board, and legislators. The commission's findings, along with recommendations, was scheduled to be released in 2017. However, the board has yet to release its final report, instead offering a preliminary summary in January 2018. From the preliminary report, we know a big part of the Commission's work is looking at how schools are funded. Article 8 of the Maryland Constitution requires the establishment throughout the state a thorough and efficient system of free public schools, and to provide by taxation or otherwise for their maintenance. The Kirwan Commission is building on the work of the 2001 Thornton Commission. Thornton was created after Maryland entered into a consent decree because courts found the state had failed its constitutional mandate to adequately fund Baltimore City Public Schools. The consent decree was a partnership between the city and state to work together to improve Baltimore City schools through new funding and leadership. Under the Thornton recommendations, school funding began gradually increasing statewide in 2002, but tapered off after the Great Recession of 2007. A state report found this caused Baltimore to lose out on over $250 million in 1 year alone. Critics say Baltimore schools have been underfunded by $3 billion since 1996. Consultants found Maryland needs to spend $2.9 billion a year more to adequately educate its students. The commission hasn't come up with a price tag yet for the policies they will propose, but that's one of the things it's still meeting to figure out. There are currently 5 working groups hammering out the details for Kirwan's major policy recommendations. Expand access to universal pre-K to all 4-year-olds, low-income 3-year-olds, and all special education students. More resources for at-risk students. Commissioners found that as a state, Maryland spends 4.9% less money on poor districts than wealthy ones. the 15th most regressive funding system in the nation. Have a more rigorous teacher training and certification process. The recommendations also acknowledge the need for a more diverse teaching workforce. Just 25% of teachers are people of color compared to nearly 2/3 of the student body. Curriculum should be able to support all students to be college and career ready by 10th grade and provide resources to those who fall behind. And finally, the state needs to increase accountability for high-quality schools and strengthen governance, including in the implementation of the Commission's proposals. In 2019, the Maryland legislature will make decisions about the Commission's recommendations, determining whether they will be implemented and how they will be funded.
Does that tell you more and give you more clarity about what the current commission is charged to do?
Absolutely.
Yes.
What did you hear, Angelique, that stood out to you? What was one of the recommendations that either maybe you didn't know as much about, or you feel like the current commission really needs to pay close attention to?
The thing that stood out most to me was the expansion of pre-K support, to expand it for preschoolers, because that's the foundation for education, period. And I have 4 kids, so I know that those years, that foundation is very important in how they progress through the years. So that stood out the most to me.
Ebony, as a classroom teacher, one of the recommendations references making sure there is a workforce that looks like the student population, that's well-trained and prepared, possibly through culturally relevant pedagogy to teach our kids. What are your thoughts on that recommendation?
So I think the recommendation makes sense. I think the recommendation is something absolutely that is needed in Baltimore City Public Schools. I look at my colleagues and going to other schools, and I do notice that the majority of the teachers who are teaching our students don't look like our students. The inability to sometimes be able to identify with our students culturally, and just even the environment. I think Baltimore is such a unique city in itself that if you don't understand Baltimore City, then you're going to have an extremely hard time reaching your students and building relationships and even teaching your students the necessary information that they need to know in order to be successful, especially leaving the high school arena. I think there is more that could be done and needs to be done in order to recruit and retain more minority and especially African American or Black teachers within the school system. I know that there's a push to do that. I guess we'll just have to see how effective the push is once everything is said and done. We were talking about it earlier. I know that we're recruiting a lot of teachers who are coming from Towson. How many teachers are we recruiting that are coming from Morgan State University and Coppin State University? And I know these schools both heavily or have large teacher populations, or people who want to become teachers going to these schools, but where are they leaving, or where are they going to teach once they leave these universities? So it's very important. It's a big deal. And I would like, next year, 2 years, 5 years from now, to see a workforce of educators who look a little more like me.
Erica, will you talk a little bit about having a diverse teacher workforce? Why would that be important for you and your family?
I think it's important for my family. I have 2 young boys, both African-American boys. I think it's important for parents to be able for parents to be able to see where their children are connecting with the teachers. You may have a well-qualified teacher who has the experience, who has the education, who has numerous certifications. But when that teacher, when he or she walks into a classroom and cannot relate or doesn't want to relate to the children, to the students, the children that are there, there's going to be a great big disconnect that will many times prevent the children from learning. And it will prevent the teacher from effectively leading and effectively teaching. Everything stems from building strong relationships. And there should be a strong relationship between teacher and student. And when there is not that ability to connect, whether it's culturally or identifying with a child's background, or even having the empathy for where that child is coming from, then there really isn't that ability to learn. There really isn't that ability to connect. I mean, we can talk all day about people who are self-made and people who are independent, but there's really no such thing. You have to build relationship with people, and just as children look up to the teacher, teachers have to look up to the children as well, in some respect.
We've all heard how critical the Kerwin Commission's work is going to be. Some call it a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make reforms in education that are really lifting up possibilities and opportunities for all of Baltimore and Maryland's children, regardless of zip code or genetic code. How have you ladies experienced engagement with the Kerwin Commission's work? Have any of you heard of or been invited to engage in the process by the Kerwin Commission itself?
No.
Not directly.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, not directly.
Yeah, not directly. I did attend something at Poly, but it was a large crowd. I didn't feel like it was a way for me to meaningfully contribute to the process or give an authentic counting of my experience or how I could benefit from the commission. So the short answer is no.
Can I just add in there, like, sometimes it feels that we're just checking off boxes, or I'll say, those people who kind of work through the Kerwin Commission to reach out to community members and to find out what's really going on and how we feel. Like you said, they hold these big meetings at Poly, and I was there too, and it was,
so was I.
It was in the auditorium, and it was packed. And there was no way to, like you said, to be able to effectively communicate or feel like your voice is being heard. But at the end of the day, they can say, oh, well, we reached out to the community members. We were there. We were inside the schools to see what parents felt, see what community members thought of the Kerwin Commission. But have they really?
What kind of engagement do you think the Kerwin Commission is responsible for in order to have real process with communities as opposed to making decisions about what's best for other people's children?
There's value in actually doing some type of outreach to different schools. Even if you identify different stakeholders who participate in any education type of events, that attend board meetings, that attend focus groups, though there's value in reaching out to those people because it gives a more authentic opinion. And I don't want to discredit anyone who is a parent that may also be, part of the commission, but I believe there's value in going to the ground and speaking to the people who are living life every day in situations that they could benefit from the resources and the exact agenda that you're trying to create. The information that I have been able to find or give feedback on, I kind of had to dig for it. And I consider myself to be a pretty engaged parent, so that's discouraging.
I think it's a loaded question. I think you have on the board and you have who's participating, who you want to participate. I think it's about, what's the word I'm looking for? I think it's about who's in a position or a place of position to be seen or to be noticed by the persons who are appointing people to the Kerwin Commission. I think, Ebony McKeever in our classroom is not going to be the person that they reach out to because how would they know to reach out to me? I think there could have been a more concerted effort to make sure that you have a wide range of voices on the Kerwin Commission to make sure that everyone who has a stake, who has skin in the game, is absolutely involved. And, you know, a lot of times we can talk about people who have children who go to Baltimore City schools, but are they really the people who have children that go to Baltimore City schools? How many people who are making decisions on this commission have children going to, you know, the schools on the west side of Baltimore, you know, on Hilton Road, or, you know? So I think I'll, you know, go back to the beginning. You have people on the commission who you want on the commission.
And if I could add, even during the feedback sessions, it appeared as though the people who were giving feedback were pre-selected. And I think there's, like I said before, there's value in talking to a family who has to hear gunshots, or who has to, their children has to walk to school in inclement weather. Those are the types of things that I may not think about, even though I have the best intention when I'm trying to affect change. But to actually communicate with someone who lives that every day, there's value in that.
I think there is an underestimation of parental power, the power that we have to manage or care for our children's lives, and the power that we have to know what's best for our children. So, with the pre-selection of the commission of the commission members, whomever pre-selected those commission members didn't consider the power that real parents, the majority of us, everyone here in the city, have when it comes to knowing what's best for our children.
So it sounds like you all agree, or you're offering that the Kerwin Commission didn't take or hasn't taken many steps to engage everyday parents whose lived experiences, or everyday students or everyday teachers whose lived experience might be most heavily impacted by their policies. Were you aware that you could go to Annapolis to their hearings?
Yes.
During the day?
Yes.
And what do you think about that process of engagement, that people would need to come to Annapolis during the daytime to attend a hearing if they want to weigh in on their child's future?
I think you already answered your own
question. I think you did as well.
Well, I want to hear from you.
Sometimes we do have to make sacrifice, and I have made that sacrifice, and not for the current commission, but on other matters in Annapolis. Sometimes you do have to make that sacrifice, but not everybody has an option to do that. And not everyone who has the right answers or the right answers for their children has an option to do that. Whatever affects the city should come right back to the city. And if it were one of those circumstances where people just don't show up, then I absolutely get maintaining the commission meeting in Annapolis. But if it's affecting the majority of the state, and not just Baltimore City, but we've got Western Maryland, we've got Eastern Shore, where practically it's just not practical for people to hop down to Annapolis for a commission meeting or commission hearing, whether it's once a month or every other week. It's not practical for people to do that.
And I also would like to say that I noticed that there are strategies that pre-K teachers will use when they're trying to convey a message to a child. They'll get eye level with them, and it makes the child feel important. Like there's power in my opinion, there's power in my voice, and it's when I am seeking a authentic connection with you to help you. And I see that same philosophy should be used in seeking community feedback. If you really want to know how I feel and what is best for me, then you'll be able to come and get to my level to get that information from me. Absolutely. So when someone doesn't do that, it makes me question their intent.
What about the elected officials who are a part of our city delegation? What do you think their responsibility was to engage us with the Kerwin Commission?
Can I go back for just a second to so one of the things that one of the primary bases for the Kerwin Commission is funding and appropriate funding and equal funding for schools. So if we already know that Baltimore City is being underfunded, we also know that things that require funding, like a car or transportation or the ability to get to Annapolis, and like you said, when we have people from Western Maryland and the Eastern Shore, and these are also economically disadvantaged communities and counties as well, if the basis for it is equal funding, how do we expect that our families and our parents are also going to be able to participate in proceedings when we already know that they're starting from behind the 8 ball and they don't have equal access to everything that they need to have equal access to in order to participate? So I just kind of wanted to add that in there as well. So it's not necessarily just about it being held in the daytime and that people are working, but also, too, are we providing access and opportunity to be able to provide everything that people need to be able to participate in the hearings as well?
So I want to go back to the Baltimore delegation and find out what you think their responsibility was or it continues to be, because the commission's work is not done to engage everyday people in informing what policies are made about their children.
I believe that they have been elected to represent me. And I believe that even if the commission did not take the time or didn't see the importance of reaching out, I believe that someone who represents me should say, hey, I don't, even though I've heard people's opinions and I've gotten feedback before, let's take the time specifically to talk about this. What do you feel? And then as my representative, you could go and advocate on my behalf, but there still needs to be some kind of interaction at that point, as opposed to a collection of what you overheard or what you may see on Facebook or something like that. So I do think that it's telling that there has not been an effort citywide to get that feedback, because they understand the issues and the obstacles that Baltimore City residents have. Like Ebony mentioned, transportation is a barrier. And if it's a barrier for me to get to work, if it's a barrier for my kids to get to school, then it's absolutely a barrier for me to travel to Annapolis.
I just want to say that I think the city delegation, the whole city delegation, is absolutely responsible for giving that information to its constituents. Every single last one of them, from the senators down to the delegates. They were absolutely responsible. I understand the Maryland's Black Legislative Caucus every once in a while has town meetings. And they address issues that are important to the Legislative Black Caucus. Every once in a while, they slip education in there, but usually the education centers around HBCUs. But when they hold those town meetings, people do come out. Not everyone does, but people do come out, and people are able to understand what that caucus is specifically focused on. City senators, city delegates could do the same thing in coming together, whether it's district-wide, 43rd District, 42nd District, 40th District, whether it's citywide or whether it's district-wide or citywide. They can come together to absolutely say, hey, look, this is what's going on. We understand that education is a priority. That's how everyone got elected the last time. Mm-hmm. That's how everyone got elected the last time. We are making education a priority, but at the same time, there are no town meetings. You're hard pressed to get an appointment with someone to find out what's on their agenda for the year. And if you do represent an organization, you have to schedule meetings in advance. Mm-hmm. And then even that organization may not have the capacity to disseminate that information to its constituents or to just general community members at best. So they absolutely have the responsibility to get those preliminary recommendations out to parents so we can be on board with it.
Mm-hmm. Ebony, did you want to add anything?
Well, no, I agree. It is absolutely 100% their responsibility. I think now it becomes sort of like the chicken or the egg question, which came first. So it's this idea that I don't think our representation of the city necessarily wants to disseminate the information or hold the town halls, because the first thing they say is, well, nobody's going to show up. Well, you can't.
They don't like confrontation.
Right. They don't like confrontation. So it's like you don't hold it and then nobody shows up. And then you have an ill-informed legislative or constituent district about what's actually going on. I do, again, think like they underestimate, again, parent power and how involved parents are in the education of their children and wanting what's best for their children. But if the parents aren't making enough noise, if they're not making enough ruckus and saying, we want you to provide the information to us, then no one's going to make that point to come out. And I think that's disappointing, and I think it's sad, and you're right. Every time an election comes up, they say we're the education candidates, and it's good enough to get the vote, but as soon as the votes have been cast, then kind of education goes to the wayside.
Business as usual.
It's business as usual. And interesting enough, it's funny, sitting here, being in a school that was, in close proximity to the Baltimore uprising, I saw every single, city council member, even those who didn't represent the district, in the school. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen a face since.
And it's just not acceptable to me to say like we didn't do it because we didn't think somebody was going to show up. Because guess what? When it's election time, I see signs everywhere. Mm-hmm. It's people knocking on my door. There's people calling me. I get 5 emails a day. If they wanted the feedback, they could get it, because I know that they know they have the tools to get the information that they need. They have the tools to reach out to people. It's just, is it important enough?
And so we know right now that in 2020, we'll be able to elect 2 members to Baltimore City Public Schools Board, but those 2 members will have limited rights
And it's not
in
enough.
relation to the people who are not elected. Mm-hmm. What will it take if electing a school board is important? What will it take to drive that policy forward so that there can be people who are representing the community that elected them?
You said it, the community. The community has to be the driving force behind it. The community has to be, the largest factor, the ones who demand it, the ones who want it. So we go back to like the grassroots movements and the organizations. And if our politicians and our elected officials don't want to be the ones to be able to provide the information to the community members, then those of us who know now need to make it our responsibility to make sure that we're informing community members and we're getting people involved to start this push to make a change for not only the school board, but just the school system and the overhaul in general.
So we recently have seen that Baltimore City Public Schools, although it started on September 4th, that for almost the whole week, there were over 65 schools that had to close because they lack air conditioning. And so students had half days of school for the entire week. Were any of you impacted by that? Were any of your students? Yes.
Personally, yes. I was a teacher at a school that was affected.
Mm-hmm. And my boys were sent home after, they were sent home 3 hours early every day.
Mm-hmm. How do you think that impacted families?
Well, as a working parent, you got to figure out childcare, especially if you have small kids who can't, walk back and forth to school. It's a hardship because now, school finally started, and don't even get me started on summer programming that's half day. It's even harder to provide, to figure out childcare during the summer months. But you finally feel like, oh, I've arrived, and now I got to tell my job, I got to leave, I got to do this. It's frustrating. I was fortunate enough that I did not directly have to deal with that, but I can imagine that that's an obstacle, because if you are working, you have to figure out like a whole nother plan. And there isn't programming available because everybody's thinking school's starting.
I know as an educator, it just threw off the curriculum. Already for the first week of school, I'm planning to, hit the ground running and start teaching my curriculum. And now I'm needing to adjust. And now from where I already wanted to be, a week and a half into the school year, I'm already behind. So, yeah.
Well, it's not even just the economic impact for the parent, or trying to find daycare or trying to take off work if they can, and they may not have the type of job where they can tap into paid time off or some other sort of benefit that they can use to compensate for that time that they would have to take off. It's not even just that; it's unsettling for children. It's. I mean, what about them? It's unsettling for children. You can't put a child in school for half a day, come home, if they're coming home or going to daycare. You can't settle them into a routine of being in school. You have your recess, you have breakfast, lunch, you got your snack, you've got your learning all day, and then you do your homework, but then you're only in school for half the day. So how can you settle into a routine of learning if you are only in school for half the day when you're supposed to be in school for the whole day? It puts them off their routine. It puts them off of their schedule, for purposes of learning, for purposes of regrouping, for purposes of resettling back into a school routine. It puts them off their schedule.
So interestingly enough, I think if this were a few years ago, we would have seen more schools close, right? So since we've had the 21st century school buildings built out, we have more schools with proper air conditioning and heating. What we saw in January, where students came back to school and there was no heat, I think the responsiveness of the school district to really create a policy that accounts for building conditions is causing us to see now buildings that have been in deep disrepair all along, right? The challenge is they weren't closing the schools when they should have been due to lack of air conditioning. How do you think it's impacting people now to actually see, oh, this number of schools is not habitable on a day-to-day basis for our students? How do you think it's impacting people, and what do you think should be done about it?
It makes me feel, it makes me believe that our children, whether it's in the city or outside of the city, because there are, as mentioned earlier, there are some other counties, non-wealthy counties that have similar issues. Even though Baltimore City schools are probably the oldest in the state, it shows that the children education is just not a priority. It is the city's responsibility to evaluate each one of those school buildings every so often, whether it's every 10 years, every 20 years, and say, this is what we need to do to keep it updated. Whether it's with the electrical, whether it's with the HVAC system, whether it's with plumbing, with all of the lead piping issues and children not being able to drink from the water fountains. I don't know how often they would do the evaluation, but every 10 to 20 years sounds a little bit more reasonable. But it just shows that our children are not a priority and never have been a priority.
And let me come from it from the other side and speak to at least the resilience of the students and the teachers. Because the fact that no one knew it was such a huge problem across Baltimore City until, the picture that the teacher had taken, and then it kind of went viral from there. Up until that point, no one had knew. And that's because educators and school staff and administration, and even the students, were making it a priority to say, come to school, we'll figure it out. I know that I have personally bought heaters and fans for my classroom to make sure that education is still going to take place in the school so that we can continue to learn and students can continue to get their education and stay on track and get all the things that they need in order to be successful. So, yes, it was exposed, but education is not a priority to certain people, but at least to the people who were inside those school buildings coming in every day. I know that education is a priority to them.
So why don't we talk a little bit more about your vision for your students, but let's ground it in kind of what your actual experiences are. What are some of the great things happening in your children's schools? What are some things that you really believe in that you would want for all students to have access to? Angel, you want to start?
Sure. So I'm a big community school advocate, and it's because I really believe in the community school model. And for people who may not understand or just don't know what that is, it's pretty much when the community rallies around the school and provides wraparound services to the families. Because the success of a child is not just on the parent, it's not just on the teacher, it's not just on the principal, it's not just on the guidance counselor, it's a community effort. And one thing that I really believe in is community schools. And my kid's school, it's in a transition phase, but I am working every day to make it a community school because I believe in what it can do. And not necessarily just for my children, but for their friends, because they're friends that I have created relationships with. I want to see them succeed also. That may not have the same type or in level of support that my kids may have because they've had a two-parent home. But I really am grateful of the teachers at my kids' school because they have been very instrumental in not just educating them at school in like math and English, but just on how to be like whole children. A lot of the after-school programming and things that my children participate in have been at the encouragement of their teachers. And I can directly, name teachers at Waverly who sparked an interest in my daughter for music, sparked an interest in my daughter for dance, sparked an interest in my son for science. These are things that, from building a relationship with my children, they said, hey, Ms. Kane, we noticed that, your child has an interest in this, and these are the programs available. So that's one thing about the community school model that I really appreciate because everyone kind of takes responsibility for the success of the children in that building.
Ebony?
There's a lot. So I'll say the first, sort of successes that I've seen just in general, and I'm going to kind of present it as an educator. So I see a willingness for students to take risk. I was laughing to myself about a question that I asked, and usually I would say like the response I would get was students would say, I don't know, or they would write IDK. But the more that we get into the school year and the more the vested the students are in their education and they're taking ownership of it, I see them writing the answers and they may be spelled wrong and, they may be written incorrectly, but I know where they're going and I know where they started from and where I can see the progression of students. But even just overall in Baltimore City schools, I've seen students who their ninth grade year, they started and they were crazy. And then their senior year, they walked out with certification in an EMT program, and now they're a firefighter and saving lives. I've seen students get certification in graphic design and other kind of computer programs that I have no idea what they are, what they do, but the students can tell you. I see students who have made records and songs and, how to use the mixing board. There are law certifications. Like, there are just so many different avenues, and I see students being successful. And I'm not necessarily sure that Baltimore City gets enough credit for the success stories that we do have in the students coming out of our school system here. And like I said, I get a little bit of an inside track because I see it. I see hundreds of students every year who are successful, who are passionate, who love going to school here in Baltimore City. So
I wanted to add to what I was saying. I really believe we touched on it earlier about the cultural relevance for the relationship between the teacher and the child, because it makes a difference when a child can look at their teacher and say, man, I really admire this about what you've accomplished, what you're doing, and I can do that. I can do that. I can achieve that because I could see myself in you. And that makes a really big difference in motivation. It's not a chore to go to school. Now, they might not like the work that they're getting, but it makes a huge difference.
And so you guys are touching on so many things that research has shown to be true. One is that people love their own school in school districts that are struggling, right? They can cite examples of pockets of excellence, even though they know there may be a larger need. With those things in mind, what are some opportunities that you think are missing from the school district and that we need to be paying attention to and bring back for all of our children?
Well, going back to the village, I know there was a time in our community, Black community, where we were more self-governing than we are now. Where at some point we have put our futures in other people's hands, and I think with respect to Black teachers leaving the system, I think at some point with job security being an issue for people outside of our community, we kind of let that self-governing means of monitoring our village go. And I think that with Black teachers leaving, whether it's because they didn't have the incentive to stay, or whether it's because we were no longer self-governing, there wasn't the ability to educate our children the way that they've always done. That was considered more effective than new standards are now. I think that teachers got frustrated. They got frustrated with new requirements.
What else? What opportunities are being held back or need to be brought to the table for our students?
Curriculum, I think, is a big issue. I look at the curriculum now, and I would say in Baltimore City schools, teachers are not allowed to, while we do have some freedom, I think the freedom that we are allowed to, that we aren't allowed to have is somewhat hindering to our students. Say, for instance, in English. English has themes that they teach, and maybe a theme is mob mentality, or maybe a theme is family relationships, or, whatever theme that they're teaching. But then they give you a select certain number of texts. You can either teach this text, or you can teach this text, or you can only teach this one text. And I've heard a lot of English teachers say that they would love to be able to have the ability to pick a text for their student that they know their students would be able to identify with, that they know their students would be interested in reading, but still meets the requirements of the theme that needs to be taught. I know as a social studies teacher, there is, unless students are taking an African American history class, which is an elective, then they're not going to get African American, Black, however you want to refer to it, they're just not going to get it because the standards don't meet it. And, the standards that are met are the things that they've been talking about since they've been in kindergarten, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the civil rights movement. But there's not enough to be able to teach them where they come from, what they look like, the kings and queens in Africa. Like, those standards aren't really built into the curriculum. So I would say, if we go back and take a look at the curriculum and make sure that we're educating the students and meeting our students, culturally relevant pedagogy, if we're meeting our students there and we're creating curriculums that are going to push them, but they're also going to meet their interests and their needs, I think we will, go a lot further. I also think the problem with the curriculum as it stands currently is that while the community does have a voice, it's a small voice. And I don't know if parents and community members and other stakeholders actually have the opportunity to choose and, let their voice be known for what curriculum they do want to see inside of schools.
So let me push you on that. Is it that they don't have the opportunity or they don't take the opportunity?
So I'll say it's more they don't have the opportunity. So I know there was an English curriculum pushed out this year, and the choices for the curriculum had already been chosen. So by the time it reached parents and stakeholders, it was, you can either choose option 1 or you can either choose option 2. But, as parents, we understand that we do that to our children all the time. We kind of push them in the path that we want them to go in by saying, you can either brush your teeth first and then, read a book, or you can read a book now and then brush your teeth later. But you're still going to do both. Right. And that's what happened right now with the English curriculum. And so then it was like, well, here's your opportunity as a community. You can choose option 1 or you can choose option 2. Community should have come out. I don't know if enough members of the community did come out to choose between the options. But, is it really a voice when it's already kind of been chosen for you, I guess?
And then I also would like to argue that while some people may not be as educated as other people, they know when they're being bamboozled. If somebody's just shining, trickling something in your hand. Yeah. They know.
The shiny object.
If I come, is it going to make a difference? And I that's when I say, engagement looks different for different people. And a lot of times there's a perception of Black parents aren't engaged in their children's education. And that is absolutely false. It just looks different. And if you've taught me that my opinion doesn't matter, then I'm not, I'm less likely to show up and give it. So I believe that it goes, like what I said earlier, it's getting eye level and understanding what the need is, what's important to you, and then making an action. There's a lot of pre-selected things, like she said, you want to read a book or brush your teeth. These are both 2 options that I'm going to make you do anyway. It's just, what order would you prefer?
And I also think, you have to keep pushing. Just because you have 2 meetings doesn't mean that there's all the meetings that there should be. Mm-hmm. And just because you had those 2 meetings and only 3 parents showed up at those 2 meetings doesn't mean you stop. You keep holding meetings. You keep letting the community know that you're going to engage them. And eventually, fill the dreams. If you build it, they will come. But you have to put it out there. And I think, as much as our city does too, I think they're better at trying to engage families, but I think that there's a lot more that they could be doing.
How did they get better? What do you think the difference was in perhaps previous interactions with the school district and more recently?
So I will say I think one is just relatability
and just to be clear, I'm asking what happened? What do you think happened that caused them to get a little better, since you've said that they've gotten better?
So I will say this, and I'll say this again, from an educator standpoint. When I first came into the district, there was a CEO here who is, and this was 2 CEOs ago, who's no longer here. And there wasn't relatability. There wasn't a feeling of this is open. There wasn't the feeling of I'm working for parents, I'm working for students. It was sort of closed off, and we're in our meeting room and we're making changes. And then when we make the changes, you all hear about them. So it was we didn't feel like we were a part of anything. And I know when I first came into the district, I just felt like I was a soldier. You give me my orders and then I go and I march out and I do what it is that you tell me to do. So I think the district is getting better in terms of becoming more relatable to parents and letting parents and students know that this is a district and we can't work unless we have your input and your participation. But I do think it's baby steps. There's more that they could be doing. I guess that's a big part of it.
I look at it at the inverse for myself. Mm-hmm. I think that, tapping back into that parental power, I get that not not all parents are on the same education level or even in the same on the same, but still the majority of us, the vast majority of us knows what's best for our children. But I think what it is that we have to empower one another to build roadmaps for those people to come to us.
Is it their responsibility to talk with you about what the possibilities are so you're better equipped to know what they need?
I mean, it is, but why are they developing the possibilities? We should be developing the possibilities. We should be saying what our child needs or what our children needs, and then we'll offer it to you.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough.
And you can take it or you can leave it. Yeah.
One thing that I can say that I appreciate about the school administration in Baltimore City Public Schools is that last year, so after Heatgate, the CEO had conversations with the CEO, and she did pretty much like a listening tour across the city at different schools for parents, community members, anybody that wanted to come. And if you just wanted to say, I like your dress, then she was there to hear that. And that's one thing that I see that came out of, the public outrage of the heating crisis. And in the beginning, people didn't trust it because it was just like, oh, you just coming around because, we was just yelling and everything else. But one thing that I can say is that there's another round going, and it was scheduled before we had the issues with the AC. So that's one thing that I can appreciate because it gives you a chance to kind of say whatever it is that you're thinking or whatever your feedback is. It could be something as small as, like I said, I like your dress, or I didn't like that. And the positive feedback is taken just as serious as the negative feedback. So that's the positive. But I also think that there are policies in place to foster that engagement. And it's just a matter of enforcing those policies. Mm-hmm. And that's one thing that I would like to see done better.
Mm-hmm. Will you give us an example?
District. So for instance, school family council. School family council is something that is mandated in policy at the district level. But a lot of schools may not have a functioning school family council, or it's not operating in the way that it's intended to. And we do have an office of family and community engagement, and I would like to see the enforcement, and even if it's just training and educating schools on what a school family council is, because it's the engine that runs the school. That's the
that's what it's intended to be.
Body. Yes, this is the decision-making body of the school, and it's designed to have every stakeholder participate. And I think on a district level, if that policy, if it's not being enforced, then it doesn't allow schools on a local level to, operate at its full potential.
So I will say this about the school family council training. I know 2 years ago that there was a focus on training members of the school family council, and they were even having the members of the engagement office go into schools. I think the problem was the training was great, but I don't think the training was there in teaching the members about how Title I budgets work and, what you need to do in order to be able to use those funds appropriately, to be able to access the funds as well. And so what happens are that, everything gets going and it's great, and these schools want to do all these wonderful things and they have all of these wonderful ideas, but then they run into roadblocks, or they are contacting the engagement office and things are happening too late. And so then they're forced to cancel, which then creates the whole, domino effect. Well, then this event didn't go off the way that it was supposed to. And we had all these parents signed up to come, and now the parents showed up and the event was a mess. So now the next time you want to hold something, parents aren't going to show up because they're thinking that it's going to kind of run the same way it did last time. So they did make an effort. I will say that. How successful the effort was is, the next step. And I don't know what happened last year in terms of training school family council, because I know there was some changes to the way the Title I budget was handled and which schools get the money and which schools don't get the money. And.
So what I hear is, I hear a little bit of a different scenario here. When I hear you talking about training, Angelique, you're talking about training for the school staff, the people who are supposed to facilitate ensuring there is actually a school family council being in place to get the training that you were talking about. And then I hear from you, Ebony, another layer of, and then when the training occurs, the depth of it or the quality of it needs to be refined so they can actually be functioning. Is that right?
It is. And I also think it goes back to something you were talking about earlier, and even like school communication. So district offices will say to the schools, because you all are the ones that are, face to face with the parents, because you are the ones that are closest to the community, we want you all to disseminate the message and the information. But some schools get it and some schools aren't disseminating the information, and then the community members aren't getting it. So it's the same way, like, it's the top-down effect, and all of it's supposed to trickle down, but everything's not trickling down in the way that it should be. So is it that, do we come up with new policies? Do we come up with, punitive, effects if schools aren't following through with what they said they were going to do? It really gets to the meat of the question and the situations of how do we make sure that training is felt school-wide? How do we make sure that policies that schools are implementing and that come from district offices are being related district-wide? School family council, like all of that communication, all of that comes in line. And it's like, I don't know. There hasn't been a perfect formula for it yet. And it's working in some districts. And I want to know, what are those districts doing where it is working that we're not doing?
Well, to me, it seems to. That should be based on school by school, because you're gonna have a principal that understands the dynamics of his or her staff in relationship with the parents and the students. So it just I don't know, it just seems like a big imposition. And going back to the village and self-governing, it just seems like a big imposition for every school to have that format. And especially if a principal already has a system that's already working.
So I think I'm hearing, I guess, principal autonomy, and I'm just not pro principal autonomy.
Okay.
So,
and the other thing is, I think also you.
Well, I hear you saying you're pro principal autonomy, but
this is my kingdom, my queendom.
Well, but I also hear you saying the principal can be as autonomous or not autonomous as they want, but the schools belong to the parents. So whatever, it doesn't really matter what the principal may or may not be doing, but then that gets back to, in some schools, the capacity of families to engage in a way that allows them to exercise their ownership and autonomy differs. And so that gets back to, a fail-safe would be requiring implementation of a school family council, because we can also see some schools where a principal will run it like it is their personal fiefdom, and that families aren't even welcome to engage or critique or ask questions about what's happening in the space, which undermines it.
And actually, I didn't mean it in that respect, where they were ruling with a
sure, and I didn't mean to insinuate that.
I meant that I think a principal, a well-grounded principal, is in the position to be able to understand those relationships, and will be able to determine whether or not
that particular structure.
Yeah, that particular structure is necessary in that school, because they might have already set up a great communication structure for between the community relations person and the parents. And it just not, or even maybe the parents run the school. Maybe the parents are the ones that set it up. Might not even be the principal. I just think it should be based on school by school. It shouldn't. The resources, the options should be there for each school to use.
So we are in a gubernatorial election in the state of Maryland, and we are hearing all kinds of competing information from the two candidates from the Democratic and Republican parties. What has been your perspective on what's coming out of the gubernatorial election? Is it close enough to the ground for you to make a decision about who has the best interests of Baltimore City's children in mind, or what other information do you want to hear from the candidates? Ebony, I see you wanting to jump right in.
So my first issue is, what I'm hearing from the Republican or the incumbent, our current governor, is that he consistently keeps saying, well, I've given you all enough money. You all have enough money. Where's the money that I've given you? And I don't think he quite understands, nor do I think he wants to understand the issues that are going on in Baltimore City, and that this isn't something that's just happened with, like you said, Heatgate in the last year, that, we are purposely underfunding our students in our educational system. There is decades history that goes back to why Baltimore schools aren't correctly funded and what's happening. I think people fail to realize that we have to pay for transportation for every student in the city from the 6th to the 12th grade because of this decision that was made to have Baltimore City be choice schools when you get into middle school and high school. You touched on it earlier. Schools don't have safe drinking water. So it comes at a cost when you have to buy bottled water for every single school in Baltimore City. I know that it's funded through grants, but we're making sure that the children have 2 meals a day, that they have breakfast, and that they have lunch every single day. So I think he's missing a lot. And I think because he was able to be elected without pandering to Baltimore City, that he clearly says, I don't need to do anything special for the residents, the students, for anybody in Baltimore City. I'm going to come out to the Orioles game. I'm going to wave. I'm going to kiss a few babies. And that is my relationship with Baltimore City. So I think it is now very interesting and very telling with our Democratic candidate that now all of a sudden there pops up a Baltimore City headquarters on North Avenue that wasn't there before. And so just my message to him is it's too late for you now to say that you have some skin in the game, because clearly for the last 3 years, you have shown that you have not cared about the students of Baltimore City. And for you to keep saying, well, I'm giving you money, is just not enough, because you're not making an active effort to really understand what's happening here in the city. And it's not, while we may ask that our mayor and our CEO do a little bit more, ultimately the major funding for Baltimore City, the governor kind of pulls the purse strings about how much money we get or we don't get. So, I don't think he's going to listen to my little voice, but I don't think he cares.
Well, I think our current governor goes through the usual laundry list of why we don't give to Baltimore City. And the usual laundry list is generally published by a very big publication in the city, of which most Baltimore City residents don't even subscribe to. But the laundry list includes, majority Black children. Okay. That's reason number one. Reason number two, majority Black supervisors, Black administration. Oh, yeah, you're misspending the money. Okay, next.
The money, yeah.
You are getting more children, more dollars per capita than any other county. What do you need the money for? How are you spending money? Check off. Okay. So another thing. Most of the children are going to wind up in prison anyhow. Checklist. Okay, so go down and that's what he's relying upon right now. So going back to what you're saying, no, he doesn't need to pander to Baltimore City. He doesn't need to pander to Baltimore City for the votes. He will get what is it, District 1? What is it, the Southeastern District? He'll get that. He'll get that vote. He will get that vote.
46.
But and he'll expect it. That will maybe give him a slight boost, but he doesn't. That's not where he's focused at. That's not where he's focused at. He's focused on
the white L.
He's focused on getting the votes he can count on. So any promises from him that I haven't seen yet, even though I've heard a lot more from him than I expected, I do not I do not have high expectations for that. The other candidate, on the other hand, I also do not have high expectations. I certainly do appreciate his sense of justice and his fight for justice. I have not heard or seen enough from him to be able to understand his commitment to Baltimore City as a whole, not even just to education, but to Baltimore City as a whole. And we haven't had that type of governor to focus on the major economic hub for the entire state, which is Baltimore City. Baltimore is a very, very wealthy city. People need to stop looking at it as a poor city. It's not a poor city. It's an extraordinarily wealthy city. The disconnect is that the wealth does not reach the city. The wealth goes out of the city. But it is an extraordinarily wealthy city.
So you're seeking specifics from the Democratic candidate.
And we haven't had it. We haven't had it.
Okay.
I am absolutely not voting for Hogan.
Tell us how you really feel.
I take offense to him calling the lockbox the Hogan lockbox. Okay, you jumped on board. I support the lockbox, but just the whole idea of, I'm going to just put my name, and take credit for something just does not sit well with me. But also, I'm not going to sit here and say that I think our district does everything perfect. But I think it is a major cop-out to call it mismanagement when there has just been chronic underfunding. And that's why I appreciate the Kerwin Commission, because it is highlighting the inequity. And this Office of Accountability, or whatever he calls it, is just frustrating to me, because no matter how you manage, if you don't have enough money, you can manage it, the best you can. But to just say that mismanagement is the issue when I know it's just chronic underfunding is just a problem for me. And while I have not heard a lot of specifics from Ben Jealous, I know I'm not going to get whatever I need from Hogan, and that Ben Jealous will put me closer to where I need to be.
So let me stick with you a little bit more, Angelique, because Erica, you surfaced this as well. Is it good enough to think that Ben Jealous is going to get us further? Or should we be expecting greater specifics to really lay out a strategy for not only economic progress, but the role of education in that economic progress, beyond maybe a statement that I'll fully fund Kerwin, absent specifics from Kerwin?
I think that, so no, it's not good enough to not have the specifics. But I also believe in, if I don't know something, I'll ask a question. And I'll ask it publicly, I'll ask it privately, and if you ignore me, then I'll just make a big stink about it, because it'll highlight that you're ignoring me. And, you can't ask for my vote if you're going to ignore me before I even can give it to you. So I think this is a great opportunity to kind of ask the questions. If the specific questions that you need answers to, ask them publicly. Send emails. You want to create a Facebook Live, ask them on the panel, the Real News Network. Ask the questions. I believe that this is the perfect opportunity to kind of, I hate to say corner people, but to get the answers that you need. And if it's not specific, rebuttal.
One of the things that constantly, we're talking about with the students, at least I know that I'm talking about with the students, is, we have to demand more from our political leaders. And I think, what you just touched on earlier, to say, is it enough to not have an answer? It's absolutely not enough. But now we're in this political space where you're always now voting for the lesser of two evils. You're no longer voting for people based on political ideology and beliefs. You're just voting and hoping that somebody gets you closer to where it is that you want to be.
I would love to close by asking you to share, what do you think next steps are for families to have the types of schools that our children deserve in Baltimore City? And share a little bit about what steps you're taking to make that happen. Angelique?
Sure. I think that families should just say what they think. Go to someone that you trust and tell them what you think. And if you aren't able to give that message directly to the people that need to hear it, ask that person to pass the information along, or ask someone to help you. Who do I need to contact? Because I know sometimes people will say, I want to help, but I just don't know how. Get in touch with, call your school and say, hey, this is what I think. Who should I talk to? Call the district. Hey, this is what I think. Who should I talk to? Call City Hall. Hey, this is what I think. Who should I talk to? Call Annapolis. Hey, this is what I think. This is where I live. Who do I talk to? Everyone has an opinion. It's just a matter of, let's not just talk to each other. Let's share that with someone who can actually make the difference. And personally, I would if I have to be the vehicle for someone, I'll reach out and say, hey, are you able to attend or send an email? And if not, tell me and I'll pass it along. So that's how I feel like I can contribute, to encourage others to say the opinion that they already have or pass it along for them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ebony?
So first, I think it goes back to one of the things that we've all kind of touched on earlier, is that regardless of the education level that parents have, parents know what their children need. And so I think we need to sort of say, parents need to be the advocate, and sort of even touching on the talented 10th and, the each one reach one kind of theory. If you're going to the school, bring your neighbor to the school with you, or, have somebody, always make sure that you're engaging as many people in the community as you can when you're advocating for the things that your students need, or, the community school needs. And again, I'll kind of go along with what you were saying. The squeaky wheel always gets the oil. So if you keep calling that principal every day, if the principal doesn't respond on day one, you call on day two. And if this principal doesn't respond after 5 times, then you need to go whoever's the next, right? Yeah, then possibly you might show up, or you start going over top of the head to get the answers that you need to get. A lot of times we are coming up in this environment where we feel like if we get an answer or we get turned away, or if the door is closed and that's just it, that's where we need to stop. I think we need some people who are willing to kick down those doors and to keep pushing to make sure that our students in Baltimore City get everything that they need. And I guess as far as I'm concerned, as an educator, I have realized lately that my passion is education, but it may not necessarily be in the classroom. So I love the classroom. I guess, should I look at a camera and say I love the classroom? I love being a teacher. But I also understand that if I want things to change for the students, if I want things to change for not only my children, but your children and your children, that I need to be involved in, grassroots organizations and different advocacy organizations. And even if I'm not a member, I need to maintain contact. I need to be working in connection with people. Because the more people that I know, the more people I can kind of recruit to say, I know this school has a problem, and I know that you're the person who can help, motivate people, or you can give money, or you can provide resources or supplies or whatever it is that we need. So that's sort of the direction I'm moving in now. I just want to, work my little advocacy and community connections and, be a bright spot for whatever we need to get done for Baltimore City.
Thank you, Ebony. Erica?
So I will have to combine both of their answers. I am, both my husband and I, we are focused on building villages, building a village, not simply for our children, but just for our community in general. And I believe in empowering people. I believe in empowering other parents. I believe in going to the powers that be and challenging them. At the same time, I believe in becoming the power, instead of waiting and going and meeting and going and running down to Annapolis or going to City Hall and not getting any answers, getting a bunch of promises, but not getting any answers. I believe in developing a powerful village that will replace those people who are already in office now, with people who will replace those people who are already in office now, people who are not focused on maintaining or keeping their seats warm, people who are focused on getting the job done, whether it's the 3 or the 4 or 5 years term, and then leaving from there. But my focus is on building power and capacity at the parental level.
I'm Dr. Khalilah Harris for the Real News Network, where we believe the future depends on knowing. Stick with us as we continue to bring you programming and reports to help you decide just what the future of education should be. Thank you for joining us.